We said that, you get lost. We have been a great civilization. You people don't know what it is. So there was a kind of, but this was a very internal. This was something, which was going on. And that is what we get to see this when we read the literature now. So there was a vilification of the other, because other was vilifying us, otherwise demoralizing us. The colonialism was telling us that you don't fit to rule yourself. That is why we are here to rule you. So what you see here is, and if you read the full circle, and I'm trying to put it like a full circle, is that where it starts is that memory, then you mark a trauma, then you see a lot of promise, and then a lot of actual achievement, what you call accomplishments. Like, you could become Nobel laureate, or you could become prime minister. But then finally, there is this disillusionment that you realize that, well, at the end of it, even then you are diaspora. And some things like anti-Indian riots in Trinidad, or something like, anti-Indian things in Malaysia or Fiji, verify that. I would, just next couple of slides, I will read one or two passages for you. Okay. Let's first look at loss. Let's, first, this is how I'm going, that I've identified some issues for you, and I'm giving you just one very indicative quotations. If you are interested, I can send you more literature online through mail and all. But here, I'm just trying to kind of just give you one snippet for every, for every theme or every, emotion, every question which they try to address. The first is about loss, but also the opportunities. They appreciated, they realized, and many of them were aware that in India, there was nothing for them. In India, the situation in 1857, the situation in 1875, massive famine, unemployment, destruction of industry, colonialism, and all that. So this is, a passage from Sudesh Mishra. And India slipped through my fingers like silk. And many other things were lost during this during that nautical passage. Family, caste, religion, yet many things were also found. He's talking about opportunity. He's talking about the optimism, the hope. Chamars found Brahmins, Muslim found Hindus, Biharis found Marathis. So at the end of the voyage, we were a nation of Jahaji Bhais. In this old literature, Jahaji Bhai is a big metaphor of community, the sense of community building. They all went on ship. So all the people who went on a particular ship, they formed this communion and brotherhood called Jahaji Bhai. They still follow it, that, okay, so his great-grandfather and grandmother were Jahaji Bhai of my great-grandmother. So the families are very closely tied. They are like, we are talking about our own uncles, our own relationships, So look at it. He's talking about the loss, and also look at the metaphor. You all be, most of you are from literature, so I don't really have to unpack the metaphors for you. Silk is the metaphor here, slipping through the fingers. Why silk? Can anyone answer? Can anyone think about it? Think about a very poor laborer, lady, silk for her. It's, if you look at if you touch the cloth, the texture, it's very slippery. So it slips very easily. But silk is metaphor for the past. And silk is also a very apt metaphor for the past, because silk is very valuable. Don't look at economy. Are you a political economist person? Somebody said that trade, silk trade and all. No, that's true. But here, it's more metaphoric in that sense, that silk is even easy to slip through, but also silk is very valuable. So for a lot of these people, what they were losing, what was slipping through their fingers, was very valuable for them, and that is why this metaphor of silk. But then also the new kind of opportunities. The caste system was very bad, very discriminatory. And a lot of these people who went were from the low caste. So they were very happy that, somewhere they are meeting the Brahmins, you know, somewhere they could, have this nation, they could bridge those divides of the homeland. They could bridge those gaps of the homeland. They could overcome those, negatives, the discriminatory structures of the homeland. So that was the opportunity for them. Also the hope, the opportunities were there, and they had this enormous hope within them. Look at this poem, a small, again, four lines from Mohit Prasad, a Fijian poet. Uh, you know, and also, that when they were there, when they went there, their real life was very tough. They were going through a very, very difficult, uh, life, exploitation, beating. I mean, all kinds of physical violence, psychological violence. The reality was, and I read, quote, uh, I caress an empty thought as I clean out a brass plate of thin dal and broken rice. So that was the reality, thin dal and broken rice bits. But look at it. Look at look at this strong, desire. Look at this optimism of this person. I'm carrying a mango seed to plant at the end of the voyage. So you go to a new land, you are carrying your culture. Mango seed here is your culture, your value, your life, your way of life. So you are carrying it, and what happens when you plant a seed? You get a tree. So today they are in a difficult situation, but tomorrow will be theirs. They continue planting the mango seed. So tomorrow, all of the Trinidad will be a mango orchard. And where does the mango belong to? That Indian diaspora. So the present is thin dal and tukde chawal, broken rice. But the future will be a mango orchard for them. Future will be theirs. So that kind of, where do you see this kind of optimism? Which poetry gives, apart, so this is where I thought that let me bring this along with Bharti Mukherjee and Jhumpa Lahiri. This is something which will be really, interesting. Achievements, Satyendra Nandan, a Fijian poet, lives in Australia. Youth I lost here, grace I have to this island place. What more than a man's age can one give to history's outrage? I have lived this exile more gloriously than Rama, and built kingdoms you may find nobler than Ayodhya. So this is where they are talking about, what all they have achieved. This is kind of a very poetic articulation, but a very true articulation. In 3 generations, actually it has started from the first generation itself, but in certain way completed in 3 generations, is that Indian laborers in Fiji who went there as landless laborers became, own 90% of the sugar plantation in that land in about 70 years time, But that doesn't mean that a lot of them sacrificed their lives. That doesn't mean that, they became the landowners, they became 90% of the total sugar plantation in Fiji. That doesn't mean that, one has to remember the sacrifices of the first generations. In Mauritius, in about 70 years, Indians were the majority. Indians were everywhere, Indians owned sugar plantations, sugar mills, and all that, And in 1967, when Mauritius became independent, and descendant of indentured laborer became the prime minister, so that's the kind of thing, which I'm talking about here. But then it's not all about that. That there's the massive frustration. There's these, and particularly in the post-colonial times, like in East Africa, Idi Amin, how Indians were thrown out, or in Fiji, where Mahinda Chaudhary is elected. Mahinda Chaudhary was prime minister. His elected government was overthrown through a coup by the native Fijian army. Or in Caribbean, where in Trinidad there was massive anti-Indian riot, and thousands and thousands of Indians were killed. You know, so Case Manian in return is writing this. He decided, he has decided when he became aware of his budding consciousness not to be influenced by other people's memories and nostalgia. He clawed at familiarity, but he only floated, you know, set adrift by the new uncertainty. They became landowners, they became prime ministers, but then, there was still uncertainty. Think about Indians in East Africa. They were so rich, you know, but then they were thrown out of East Africa with $10 in their pocket by Idi Amin, and given 24 hours to vacate, you know, another unfamiliar landform. Like Davidine Vincoli Odyssey writes, and a river boat packed with crying and dead, like old days. When they arrived in Trinidad, they were crying, they were dead people on the river boat. Also the days of lash and chain, the days of servitude, the day of slavery. Another issue which I wanted to bring in here is that normally when we think about the literature of old diaspora, and also when we look at the history of old diaspora, it was basically a male dominated. The laborers were male, strong, able-bodied. It was a very, male kind of a order. And so when we look at literature, and if you remember my slide earlier, I gave you some names. Let me just go back to that quickly. Almost all of them are men, So somewhere when we are looking at the literature of old diaspora, what happens is that it becomes a very male kind of a literature. Look at Naipaul, look at the women in that story. I'll come to it later, but when I say the literature of new diaspora, new Indian diaspora, you think in your mind, what are the names which come to your mind? Whether they are male or female. When I talk to you about the Indian diaspora in UK and US and their literature, think about the writers, think about the people who are writing on that, and think about their gender. Okay, but let me come to this first. So that was the kind of a prevalent trend, but that is not going on. That's something which is being challenged very effectively. And that is why I showed you this book. It's a thin book, but it's a very, very important book in that ways, that there is a new kind of a literature which is coming from this, and particularly from Caribbean. I don't know if you are familiar, but in literature, and particularly in the post-colonial literature, Caribbean is a big location. Caribbean is big, like in many places, in England, particularly in a university called Warwick. Warwick has a full, it's being taught as a kind of like you study the British poetry or something like that. Caribbean is now a new genre of literature. It's being recognized. Like you have African writing, Caribbean is being recognized as a very powerful voice in literary tradition. There's a very famous poet. She died very young. She was an anthropologist at Johns Hopkins called Mahadai Das, and her collection of epic called They Came in Ships. And there is another very famous poet. She is an engineer by profession called Leelavati Manu Rahming Singh, Battlefields of Freedom. So that is where they are trying to renegotiate. They are trying to reclaim that old diaspora, that it was not all so male, but they were very important, gendered space. And that is why it's being called the reclaiming. They're trying to reclaim, they're trying to recapture, because somewhere in this progression, it was denied to them. I have just two quotations for you, one from Mahadai Das, my personal favorite poet, and another, Leelavati. She's an engineer, she's a dear friend, and you can find some of her poetry online also. Madai Das, triumphant from dark days of starvation, I rise from grave. Look at this metaphor that somewhere women were buried in the narrative, in the literature. Blood thin, walk, body weak, will too exhausted to claim the glory of for my victories. The diaspora could not have sustained itself if there were women. There were no women, but they were buried. They were put into graves. They didn't get their due, and that is why we have this reclaiming. Leelavati says, my words on this, and Leelavati is more fiercely what I mean, feminist, if I use the word called feminist, more fierce, more aggressive, radical. My words on this battlefield, I write with this gun. I fight for my freedom with this pen. So look at the kind of fierceness, look at the radicalism in this. So with this, that old diaspora literature ends. There is an insertion in between. And that is what we call the literature of twice displaced. I don't know, any one of you have heard the name called M.G. Vasanji, a writer?
Yeah, Sri Lankan writer.
Some say Ramabai Spinnet.
We are looking at the history of Indian diaspora, and as I was just talking to you about, what we get is that these communities which once went from India to say East Africa, and then subsequently in the post-colonial times, they were forced to go, like they went from India to East Africa in say 1850s, 1870s, 1880s, and again when the long process of decolonization has started, many of these people, and that in 1960s, many of these people, the Indian diasporic people, were asked to leave. I would suggest it's available on internet also, and it was Meera Nair's first film called Mississippi Masala. I don't know if one of you have watched it, but it's on YouTube, and watch it. It's an amazing film. If someone is interested in diasporic movies, then Mississippi Masala is an amazing film to watch. Move away from Karan Johar and Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge. They are very cliche. The powerful movie is Namesake, and the powerful movie is this one which I just mentioned, Mississippi Masala. So what happened in their life is, that when people move, it brings certain anxiety in their life. It brings certain, instability, unstable kind of a thing in their lives. They're not very certain about things. But gradually they make the new land their home. They stay, they become familiar, and gradually they feel more settled. But what happened in this particular case, and that is why we call it literature of twice displaced, is that by the time they started feeling at home in East Africa or Trinidad, they were asked to leave again. By the time they built their houses, by the time they got a job, by the time they got married, had children, by the time they bought a car, they were asked to go. So that brings in a very strange kind of uncertainty, multiple dislocation, and that is why we need to read this literature a little differently, because this literature never gives you the sense of stability. This literature, the self in this literature never gets fixed. They never get, settled. They are caught between, and that is why, look at these novels. The titles are themselves so suggestive. Ramabai Espinete, Swinging Bridge. Swinging Bridge. It's unstable. Or No New Land. Vasanji is talking so frustratingly that now I'm in Canada. Vasanji is member of parliament, a very famous lawyer. But then Vasanji says that, well, at the moment, I'm very happy. It looks very happy. But I don't know if it will be the same land. I will be asked to leave again. So that kind of multiple uncertainties. And that is why this literature is a slightly different angle. It's again from another place, but this is a poem from which with which Vasanji starts his novel called No New Land. You tell to yourself, it's by C.P. Kavafe, The City. You tell to yourself, I will be gone to some other land, some other sea, to a city lovelier than this. There is no new land, my friend, no new sea. For the city will follow you in the same street, you will wander endlessly, you know. Now I come to this. I'll be very quick on this because most of you are very familiar with this genre called the literature of the new diaspora. And some of you answer. I come back to my question. Some of you have answered very appropriately. Is that when we are looking at the literature of new diaspora, almost all the writers are female. You know, I'm not complaining. I'm very happy. And one must be very happy about it. I'm just putting it in the comparative perspective. When we are looking at the literature and how it says a lot about the gender space in the diasporic lives. When we were talking about the literature of old diaspora, then the names even I could find for yourself are mostly women. Mostly men, you know. There is a new kind of a book, new assertion where Leelavati has to say that I'm taking out my sword, my pen is my sword. You know, that kind of a radicalism has to be asserted. But when we are looking at the new diaspora literature, it's so obvious. I start counting the name and you will find it so difficult finding a male writer here, you know. So I'm not complaining. I'm trying to put it in perspective that actually by looking at simple this, one can gaze a lot, one can read a lot about the gender space in the diasporic lives. You know, the changing role, the changing positioning of women, where in old diaspora, they were looked at characterless, you know, loose character, even, you know, nationalist leaders like Gokhale, Gandhi, C.F. Andrews were so contemptuous about their lives, these women's life. And now the new one, where if you look at, you know, you go to any university in North America, I meet so many women professors, you know, Gayatri Spivak, to, you know, Bharti Mukherjee, endless, you know, in sciences, in literature, in nuclear science, in political science, you know, in medicine, in engineering. So that is what I was trying to indicate. I was not complaining. The ladies here, the women here and the men also, don't, feel that I'm hurting sensibilities. I'm not happy. There are so many women writing about the diaspora. I'm very happy. I celebrate it. I'm just trying to give it a perspective in that sense. So the new literature, the background, the backdrop, the world around us, what we call is the transnational world. The connections are very quick. You know, we have internet, we have flights, we have travels. So what it happens is that what we call as identity, I'm not getting into identity because that's a full lecture in itself. About this hyphenation, you know, you have multiple realities and they come together. They are part of you. Indo-American, you know, kind of hyphenated, where India remains in you, but you have become American. You know, there's a very famous book, a very good book called Being Indian, Becoming American, you know. So that hyphenated reality. Also, a lot of these people are very highly educated. These writers are very highly educated. I'll just take a few minutes. Please bear with me. I hope it's all right. Yeah. Who is hosting now? Anyway, okay. Because I haven't got any reminder, let me go. Okay, so what if you read LRB, London Review of Review of Literature, or all kinds of new powerful literary writing, literary criticism kind of writings, then Indian diasporic literature is now being celebrated as being of high culture. You know, Our people are winning Booker. Our people are winning Pulitzer. Our people are sitting into the, Academy of Arts and Literature, Harvard Academy to, British Academy, to American Academy of Letters. So they are very much in the circle. They are not marginalized. They are not, a marginal voice in the mainstream. South Asian diasporic literature now is of very high literary culture and is a very powerful voice, So some of the writers, Rusty, I've included because of some of his post-colonialism writings, but Rusty, I want to take out from this. But Rohinton Mistry, Bharti Mukherjee, Jhumpa Lahiri, Chitra Banerjee, Manju Kapoor, and the list goes on, So you have, Brick Lane, Monica Ali and all that, Punjabi Parmasin, Jameen Akhtar. I mean, there are many, many writers now. Like I followed earlier, I've tried to identify some themes for you. And I've also tried to compare it with the earlier one, if you remember. So now in this books, if you remember, most of you have watched or most of you have read Namesake. Should I pick up that as my classic example? Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Please do, sir. Please do. Please do.
Namesake, if you remember, it's about a young couple, gets married in India, goes to US, and starts living their life. It starts negotiating their life. It doesn't talk about any big plot. It's about a simple story of one family's movement from a country to another country where the person goes to study first and then gets a job, like the usual, like the very ordinary. It doesn't get into the big global flow of labor force. It doesn't get into that large plot. It doesn't get into any kind of, relationship between India and US. It doesn't get into that. It's just a simple story. So what you see here is move from the large scale historical plots to everyday life, everyday realities, The second is, unlike the older one where there was no hybridity because different communities were not meeting, in the new one, there is enormous hybridity. You all must be teaching and reading Homi Bhabha, So, and so many others, from Clifford Geertz to Paul Gilroy to all that kind of, cross-cultural hybrid. The larger argument they make through hybrid that no culture or no identity can be a pure identity. There's nothing called authentic, I'm not getting into those. So basically what you have is the reality of our time is that we all are hybrid. We all are cross-cultural, and when we are in diaspora, we meet with the host. Like when I'm in London, I'm meeting with British people, but I'm also meeting with African people. I'm also meeting with Chinese people. And then how do we relate? So it's not the relationship between home and the diaspora, but also the inter-diasporic relations. The third is the very closeness to the home, representation of the real home. When Naipaul was writing, or when Shiva Naipaul was writing about home, his home was a memory, But when Jhumpa Lahiri is writing about home, you don't know, maybe she is sitting in some hotel in Connaught Place or some hotel, some backwater resort in Kerala and writing about that, which she thinks that which you read and which you perceive and read as that she's writing about India sitting in Berkeley. So that kind of also through internet and through frequent travels, we all know, even if I'm sitting in, say, Mozambique, I'm sitting in Mauritius, or I'm sitting in Washington, DC, through internet, through news channel, through satellite television, online newspapers, and a phone call back home, I know what is happening in India. Kejriwal has won so many seats. Our Kerala is doing so good in dealing with COVID-19, and why, Madhya Pradesh is not being able to do so well. So even if I'm in Washington, I know all about it. So when I'm writing about my home, the diasporic home, it's very real, But when somebody was writing about home in the old diaspora, it was the memory from his great grandmother, That is why a lot of these people, when they come to India from Mauritius, they come to India, and when they see India, they get a shock for their lifetime, because their image of India is an agrarian country of very poor people, desperate people, half naked. But when they come here and they see that we have metro before them, and we have amazing highways, and we have airports which match any best airport in the world, they get the shock of their life. When they see us driving BMWs, India has the highest selling of Jaguar and, Land Rover. So when they come and see us driving Jaguars, they get the shock, because they thought that we would be still riding a bullock cart, because that is what they were being told by their great grandparents.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So that's what happens here, that now the home is very real home, because they know, Indian diaspora in London knows that Jaguar and Land Rover is a British company, automobile company, but actually it is being owned by Tatas. When Boris Johnson, British Prime Minister, goes to ICU because of COVID, who was running the country? Priti Patel.
Indian,
An
yes.
Indian origin person, so you can think of the
Two
positioning of Das.
them.
Yeah, the other is Infosys, Narayan Murthy's son-in-law, Ronak Shawn.
Rishi Munak.
Rishi Sonak.
Rishi Munak.
So that kind of familiarity, that kind of global connection. Also, the thing is that when you go to diaspora, you are not unfamiliar with diaspora. When I'm going to London, through internet and through travel guides and through my friends who are already in London, I know what is there in London. I know how many Indian restaurants and which I can afford and which I cannot afford. And I know that there are a couple of diasporic Indians who are very prominent in British system. So that strangeness is very low. When this indentured laborer, Girmitia, what we call them, were going to Mauritius and Fiji, they had no idea where they were going.
No idea at all.
So the intermingling of difference and familiarity is very different here. A lot of them, when they were going to Mauritius, they were told that you are going to a next village, They were told that it will take 7 hours, and actually the journey was 90 days, and they had no idea. So, and finally, what we take the refuse in, whenever we don't understand anything, we call it globalization, is this new optics of globalization, the global network. If some of you are familiar with a scholar called Arjun Appadurai, and I suggest, he has a book called Modernity at Large, which actually we all must read. I'm a great admirer. You may call prejudiced, but Arjun Appadurai has bring in culture in globalization. Globalization is normally we look at as economic, but Arjun Appadurai has inserted culture. He says that, a lot of these processes are very cultural, and that is where diaspora is very important in modern globalization. There is a very famous Indian restaurant in London. It is running because there is Indian diaspora in London, So the economy of Indian food, which is global, ready to eat kind of thing, or restaurant business, is because of this cultural transition, because of this movement of communities. So commodity is very linked to community. Economic is very linked to cultural, Economic, if it is just economic, then it can be very ruthless and there will be, rebellion. But economy, when it gets into cultural, then it becomes acceptable, then it becomes more convincing. Okay, so very quickly, what I do here is few things. Anxiety about origins, but they are very willing to change. Then, this dialogic, because of this continuous travel and connection, you are living a life like dual life. You are simultaneously in here, matlab in homeland, but also out there, out in diaspora, And the third one, which is very important, is, and which I spent some time, so I will not spend so much time right now, is this gendered world. So from what you get here is, there is this person who I see a photograph, Kalbi Saab Mujawar, on Royal Enfield. Sorry, don't, that diverts my attention because I love motorbikes. So it takes me away from my lecture. But anyway, I love this photograph, nice, and Royal Enfield, nice bullet motorcycle. So let me come back. So the gendered space, from a male dominated to a gendered world, and that is what I was talking about here for you. But something which I wanted to point out to you, something which doesn't come so often. I'm a little, critical of. So let me bring out this, this Orientalism kind of thing in these writings. This exotic Indian. You try to, in these writings, if you read these, like even take the namesake. So when we are talking about India, we are still talking about India, which is not familiar with the washing machine. You remember that scene from the movie, which is there in the novel also, where she puts woolens in washing machine and they all shrunk and they become unusable. What does it try to portray? That India is not familiar with washing machine. So you're trying to portray an exotic East, certain kind of trapping within the Orientalist framework of Edward Said, where Orient is exotic, Orient is snake charmer, Orient is cultural, Orient is, about festivals, Orient is about puja part, and West is the real West. West has the washing machine. West has the modern technology. So we are somewhere trapped into. It's an amazing novel, but think about it from this perspective, that how this amazing novel gets trapped into Orientalist framework, the limitations of Orientalism. The second is, what Bharti Mukherjee says in an interview about the surrender. So when, every migrant, even when somebody is coming from Bihar to Kerala, or a Kerala laborer going to Dubai, or an IT professional going from Hyderabad to Silicon Valley, migrants surrender. That's the reality. That is where that trauma comes. That is where that, that kind of psychological and emotional sense of loss comes. But then if you read some of these books, they romanticize this surrender. They try to cash on. They try to capitalize on that surrender. Look at Bharti Mukherjee. This is from an interview. She says, I was opting for fluidity, self-invention, blue jeans and t-shirt, and renouncing caste observance. My books have often been read as an unapologetic test for cultural and psychological mobilization. It's a word I celebrate. Or many of you who had idea about cultural studies, and when you study communities, human beings, mobilization is a very, very negative word. It's about giving up. It's about, force that you become unreal. You lose yourself, And then where it goes is the celebration of hybrid. Celebration of hybrid is amazing. I really, appreciate that. But the first two are where I'm kind of a little, I'm not so comfortable with using that. There's very little about the, when you read the new literature, it's all about the people who are working properly, who are doing good job, who are, who our middle class basically. But then, if you look at Indian diaspora anywhere in the world, particularly in the Western world, like say United States or UK or Germany, you know that there is a lot of illegal. There are a lot of people who are between legal and illegal. If you go to New York City and you take a taxi, there's all possibility that your taxi driver will be from Pakistan or Bangladesh or from India. If you go to Toronto, if you go to Canada, 90% chances that your cab driver will be a Sardarji, So, but we talk very little about them, Uh, finally, this where literature becomes the commodity. Literature often is being considered as a cultural representation, something which is not a commodity, but if you look at the literature now, what happens is that it is a commodity. If you want to contact Amitav Ghosh, you know whom you will have to contact first, his agent. A writer, and almost all the writers have literary agents, who negotiate. You cannot, if you want to invite Bharti Mukherjee for your, conference, you have to contact her agent. Jhumpa Lahiri, you cannot access. Unless you are of that stature, the agent will talk. So what happens here is that in this celebration, this globalization, in the process of globalization, diaspora is inevitable. Diaspora is the necessary condition. So knowing about diasporic communities, reading about them becomes very, very important. But then it is part of that, and that is where the diasporic literature is being celebrated. But then it is being celebrated in certain way, like a product launch, like a Jaguar car is launching a new model. So what happens? First, or like a movie is being launched. First, you have this thing called trailer. First, you have a kind of a pre-launch kind of a thing. You get a brochure where you see the sketches of the new model of the car, and then there will be a kind of a pre-launch event where they will reveal some images of the car, and then finally the car is launched in the market. So by the time the car is launched in the market, there is a desire to buy it. People would looking forward to that. Okay, this car is being launched, and it looks like an amazing car. Similarly, if you look at, and that is where literary festivals come to play the role, and that is why someone like me, you may say that I'm not a literature person, so I don't like literary festival. But someone like me who would never like to attend a literary festival is that, a lot of, there are very genuine literary festivals. I'm talking about a literary festival like Jaipur Literary Festival, they are not, so the writer is coming and he's reading excerpts from a newly published book. People get, and mostly the controversial excerpts from the book are making some very bold statement, and then they create a desire. The books are being sold. The incentive is that you get the autographed copy of the book. So someone like Jhumpa Lahiri, I go to her place in Jaipur Literary Festival, and I buy the book, and she writes to Amit, with love, Jhumpa. I bring it, I put it in my bookcase. You can see behind, and I put it as a very prized possession. But, and she says that to Amit with love. But does that mean, Jhumpa, if I meet her tomorrow, she may not even recognize me because she has signed 20,000 copies the previous day, and she has written with love to 20,000 different people. So that is what I'm trying to, I may sound a little, what you can say, senile, but, but that's the reality, that where culture becomes industry. Someone just, I think, wrote a message called cultural industry. The culture becomes industry, capital culture becomes part of that global capitalism, you know. And that is what I said, that, you know, the optics of capitalism is here. Finally, I make my case in that, and I go back to Gayatri Spivak's, you know, statement where she says that diasporic literature is irrelevant, why it has become so important, it's narcissist. But, you know, if we read it, and as I was saying when I was talking about methodology, when we are reading the diaspora, about the diaspora, not all the diaspora is so articulate, particularly the old diaspora. They were illiterate people. How do I know about their lives? You know, because when we go back to literature, you know, diasporic literature provides what you call the agential function to the diaspora. Diasporic people are not recorded otherwise. So what gives them the agency is this creative domain called the literature. They want Jhumpa Lahiri, say, you know, who is namesake writer. I'm sorry, I'm bad in some just names. But, you know, someone like Bharti Mukherjee gives voice, gives agency to thousands and thousands of Indians who live there, you know, but they cannot write about their experiences. And I, as a scholar, or I, as a student, wanted to know about this. So I go and read Jhumpa Lahiri, and I get to know about the lives. I get to know about the ordinary lives. If you look at the newspaper, which is a source for information, the newspaper will cover about, you know, Satya Nadella. Newspaper will cover about Lakshmi Nivas Mittal in diaspora. News will cover about this. Who is the other person? Sundar Pichai. News will not cover about an ordinary IT worker and his life. So how do I know about that? Where does that ordinary, you know, IT worker gets his space, our agency to write? Through this literature, you know? I think you must have read the point. What I, you know, that sublime kind of representation, which you don't get into the usual kinds of representation like newspaper and its other kinds, television channels and all that, you know. Thank you. I leave it with this, and I'm sorry I exceeded all the time given to me. It's very late, but feel free to ask me questions. I'm happy to answer if the organizers are all right, if there is a space for question. And I hope that you got, I mean, I'm intruding in your domain. I'm again saying that I'm not a literature person, but I hope you got some sense. It was meaningful in half an hour of 1.5 hours of your afternoon time, you know. If some
Hello, sir. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much, sir. Yeah, Imran, continue.
Sir, I'm Imam from Karnataka, and I'm a research scholar at Rani Chennamma University, Belagavi, under the guidance of Dr. Nagaratna Parande, madam. And also, I'm the student of Fayaz, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, I have the one doubt, and if I'm wrong, please correct me here.
Yes,
sir,
please.
How Westerns are reacting to the interpretation of the immigrants' experience and their feelings in the foreign land, because all the immigrants, that is the migrated or the Indian diasporic writers, are writing for the Western audience only, because some texts are not available in Indian book stalls, and how these novels are going to be concerned there to academia, that is how they are going to taking or putting these books in their universities, because in India we are keeping a separate paper for all the diasporic works as a mentioning with the Indian diasporic writings, and how these Indian diasporic novels are going to be studied there, and how much they are going importance to the giving importance to the feelings of the immigrants and their experience, because they are not going to feel those experience there, that is the Westerners. So please put light on this.
I don't know if I got it right, but let me try. Interesting observations that how do you, I mean, what you meant, let me rephrase it and correct me if I'm right. So basically you wanted to know that how the Western world is responding to this literature. Is that
Yes,
so?
sir. Especially
Yeah.
the experience of and feeling of the immigrants there
Yeah.
and their writings.
Okay. So let me, there are two levels of it. One is
the typical academic response to it. They welcome it, they like it. It's being taught all over. If you go to any American universities, many places, like in this universities in Britain, they have
literature. They have courses on world literature where sometimes Indian diasporic literature fits in. Many a times they have courses on South Asian diasporic literature. So in that ways, it is welcomed. It is being accepted. But if you bring it to the popular from that liberal academic domain, then there is a lot of resistance to it. Many a times, and so, but before that, let me tell you why diasporic literature became important is because, a lot of these countries, particularly the countries which claim to be multicultural, like Britain, like US, like Germany, like Canada, they wanted to know about these people who are different culture, so that they can build policies, they can, talk about them. They are there, but the people don't know about them. And that is where literature helps to understand that who are these people. So that is where diasporic literature becomes very important as a source, as an information about the other who is living next door, but you don't know about him. Think about, a white person living in somewhere in London and his neighbor is an Indian. The white person doesn't know anything about Indian. So he reads a novel about them and then he knows something about them. So diasporic literature has that functional role, as a source of information, as the source of becoming familiar with. And that is where it was welcomed. But then, gradually what happens if you get into the real lives, and some of it you see, I don't know if you are familiar with someone called Mohsin Hamid. He's a Pakistani writer living in the United States, and a book called Reluctant Fundamentalist. That is also a film now. Are you familiar with anyone?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Yes, sir.
yes, sir.
Yeah. So
Yes,
if you read Reluctant Fundamentalist, that will answer your question.
It's
That how,
9/11 after the scenario. 9/11 scenario is presented. 9/11 scenario in
post
New.
9/11,
Yeah,
the life of a diasporic person post 9/11.
Yes.
9/11 becomes very important because a lot of things, how someone was thinking about in South Asian pre 9/11 and how someone has started thinking about a South Asian post 9/11, it has changed. So that is where I see that, at popular level, there is a massive dislike. So it's a both way that, at one level, in a sophisticated middle class elite functioning, it is welcomed. At another popular level, it is not welcomed. It is being looked as the literature of the people whom you don't like. So you don't like the people and you don't like their literature. You detest them, When you see Bharti, say Jhumpa Lahiri or someone receiving Pulitzer Prize, look at how much racism goes in the popular media in US. That Pulitzer is not this lady from South Asian accent and origin doesn't deserve to be winning Pulitzer. So who should be winning Pulitzer? So there is all kinds of feelings. I hope I'm kind of okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. Is it okay? I mean, you got something?
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello, hello sir. This is Bhumika from SNDT Women's University. I'm pursuing my master's in literature first year.
Yeah. Is Mumbai, SNDT Mumbai?
Yes sir, SNDT University Mumbai.
Okay. Yeah,
So
yeah.
my question to you is that whenever we speak about diasporic literature, we always talk about people moving away from their homeland to some other country, and how they have this feeling of loneliness and how they miss their homeland. But sir, in the context of Kashmiri Pandits, my question is that looking at their condition, how they were forcefully removed from Kashmir overnight, and I mean, if the literature written by them, how is that literature considered as diasporic literature?
It's a big question, and it's basically a question which is not so much about literature, but it's a question about how the diaspora as a kind of a category is defined. You know, I know that people who were displaced from Kashmir are people, you know, even say northeastern people living in Delhi, you know, these kind of communities, the sense of alienation, the sense of displacement is very similar to diasporic displacements, you know. But unfortunately, the way diaspora is defined till date, I'm not saying that this is how it will be from till the time, you know, till so long in future. But the way diaspora is defined at the moment is about the trans-border, transnational migrations, you know, within the nation, even if it is very similar to diasporic dislocation, even the feeling, the sense of alienation and displacement is very similar to diasporic displacement and alienation. We don't call it diaspora. You know, so it's not about literature. It's about how the subject itself is defined. Okay, so that's a limitation. I hope that one day we include that literature into diasporic literature, and I really hope so. But at the moment, diaspora is not defined like this. You know.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I am Origin Mondal from Pondicherry University.
Yeah,
So first of all, I thank you for your wonderful presentation. I think it was a wonderful presentation. And sir, in one of your slides, you have mentioned the term exclusivism, which is the one of the many themes of diaspora. Can you throw some light on the term exclusivism?
That I used in the context of old diaspora, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Is this what you, let me go back to that slide. This one is what you meant?
No.
Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So exclusive here is basically, you know, that they were not connected. They were not interacting with others. Okay. Like they were not getting into that post-colonial hybrid condition. And that is where they remain exclusive. They remain original. They remain singular, you know. Because if you look at, I mean, if you may not be familiar with this, but what happened is that these laborers from India were taken to Mauritius and South Africa and other places, and they were put on the plantation. Okay, they had no interaction with the native African or any other cultural, ethnic, racial community. So they were there as they went from India. They were in diaspora, but they were not interacting with any other, you know. So they remained very exclusive. That is what I meant here.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
Sir?
Yeah. Who is this? Yeah, please.
Hi, sir. I'm Suman from Karnataka.
Okay. Yeah, Suman. Hello.
Suman.
Suman, your
Anita
voice is
Desai
breaking.
has written one. work that is known as By Blackbird.
Yeah, yeah,
This
yeah.
fiction is also considered as a diasporic fiction work by
Uh,
Blackbird.
uh, I don't know. I I would not ideally like to consider it, because you remember when I don't know, but when I was talking about what is diasporic literature, there is one thing which was very important, is that the subject of it should be diasporic, you know. But it's a debated thing. My take is, a lot of writers, a lot of scholars, a literary critique would call anything diasporic literature which is being written by a diasporic writer. Like, uh, someone is sitting in London and then writing anything about India, that is also considered as diasporic literature. But as a kind of from that, narrative aspect, or from what you call the reflective methodological aspect, I would not like to call it diasporic literature. I would call something diasporic literature only when the subject of it is about diaspora. When the plot, when the story is about diaspora. So for me, House for Mr. Biswas is a diasporic novel, but something like India, A Million Mutinies Now is not a diasporic novel. It's a travelogue. It's a memoir of homeland in a different way. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, you people are from literature. I mean, I would not really like to give a kind of a definite answer on it. I'm just sharing my perspective, that how, as an outsider, I would like to read something as diasporic literature.
Yeah, that's okay, sir. That's perfectly
Yeah,
all
that's
right.
okay.
Yeah, that's
100%
perfectly all right.
correct. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Sir, I'd like to ask you one question. I'm Dr. Ranjana Mehrotra from Agra. With every generation, the diasporic experience changes. The first generation experiences it in a different manner, and then second also. So like in Jumpaleri also, we see the varying shades of the diasporic experience. So what is your take on this, that the present day generation who have been in America, who've been born in America, their parents were born in America or other countries, how do they relate to India?
Yes, generation is one of the biggest questions which we have to deal. I mean, as an ethnographer, as a historian, this is the biggest challenge we have to deal. Because, everything, whether it is about home, whether it is about cultural persistence, whether it is about identity, anything, whatever you think about a pertinent question in diaspora studies, it changes with generation. The way first generation who have been moved from India, the way they relate to homeland is very different from their children or their grandchildren would relate to. And that is where we see a lot of conflict between generation. A lot of novels, and as you said very aptly, Jumpalari, a lot of these novels deal with this generational conflict very, very nicely. So yes, I mean, it does change, and it's a big thing, and a good literature should address that. There are a lot of films which do address that, like say Bend It Like Beckham, made by Gurinder Chadha. And Namesake, the novel deals with the generational question very, very,
very wonderful, very nice,
wonderfully, very well, very nicely. So I think the generation is one of the biggest challenges in studying diaspora, that how do we deal with, because the meanings change, everything, identity, food, cuisine, culture, dress, everything changes with diaspora. A lot of parents, particularly the South Indian parents, I know a lot of Tamil people, we did some research on them. They want their children to learn classical music from Tamil Nadu and dance from Tamil Nadu. The children don't want to. They want to learn hip hop, And also there is a very interesting article by one of the ethnographers called From Hina to Hip Hop. from Mehdi, to hip hop. So it's all about, and it's very interesting to read. And also it's very interesting to see how the parents want to impose, a lot of their things on the children, and how children resist that. It's an amazing story. So yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Karnataka, Sarfraz Ahmad. I would like to ask one thing, sir, that with comparison to old diaspora,
yeah,
and referring with the contemporary issues of present, what are the problems facing in foreign, the people of Indians or of somewhere else who are residing at foreign land? What is the difference between the old diaspora and the new one? Or how do you justify, or how do you compare? What are the present problems that they are facing at each generation level in foreign countries?
Okay, so what is it? I mean, how the old diaspora and the new diaspora?
Yeah, earlier it was a trauma, or of they're all in the concept of memorizing their homeland. But after now, at the generation level, what do you call technically high level, we are residing in the foreign countries now. We have everything if provided globally, very common thing. But my question is direct is that right now, what we are the facing problem in foreign countries? I mean, the second generation or third generation people who are residing in foreign countries.
There's a big question. You see, it's about levels of assimilation. I think, that how you get assimilated in the new country, how much do you change, how much you want to retain the original self. If you are thinking about the old diaspora, then the persistence is very symbolic. Like if we take the example of Mauritius, then we are talking about the fourth and fifth and sixth, I mean, basically fifth and sixth generation, and oldest, even if you think it's fourth generation. So for them, being Indian is very symbolic. It's because they are citizens of a post-colonial nation, Mauritius, and for political reasons, they don't want to call themselves Indian. At max, they would say hyphenated. They would say, "Theek hai, India was land of my ancestors." If you meet a South African, Indian diaspora in South Africa, where there is a kind of a crisis, or in Malaysia, they would never identify with India. They would say that South African first, and then comes everything else. So there is this kind of a political somewhere thing, political compulsion, the political correctness, that they don't want to call them. I mean, they are in South Africa. Their great grandfather moved from India to South Africa, so they don't want to bring that, because the moment they say that I'm an Indian, the native government will say that, okay, so get lost. That kind of a political compulsion which they have to be identified with the land. But then, think about Malaysia. Indians are there, the Tamil Indians are there for 4 generations now. But even today, the post-colonial Malaysian nation doesn't recognize them as native Malaysian. They are not son of the soil. They are not called Bhumiputra. So they are there, they claim themselves to be Malaysian, they have the Malaysian passport, but they are not Bhumiputra according to Malaysian constitution. So they cannot go to a university. They cannot set up a business, So that's the old diaspora. Now looking at the new one, if we look at the new one, and if you look at the second or third generation, because Indians started going there in 1970s. So now the third generation is in the colleges, are at maximum, say, second generation in certain cases for the late immigrants is in the college. So they want to identify themselves with hip hop. They don't want to, eat burger, masala dosa. They are happy with their sandwich and burger and, pizza. But what happens is, so they are American. They have American passport. But many a times you see these hate crimes, there many a times, in 1980s, this was very common in parts of Canada and US, that they would attack young Indian girls in colleges, and they would hit on their forehead. Because if Indian women wear bindi on the forehead, you know. So that was a kind of marker for Indian women that they wear a bindi here to look different from any other ethnic community. So they would attack on their forehead. They would mark it, or they would put some ink, or they would sometimes throw stone. Basically on the this gang was called, you can Google it, was called dot busters. You know, dot is the bindi, so dot busters.
Right.
You know, so it, what you are trying to, you know, what if I got it right, is that it's, you see, how I'm being perceived, how I'm being, you know, how I'm negotiating is not only dependent on me. You see, diasporic negotiations is also dependent on the other, particularly the host. I want to be an American. I've given up. You know, I'm kind of get into that, you know, what you can call in identity formation. I'm changed. I've transformed. I've given up persistence. I've started eating burger. But then whether the other is accepting me as American or not is a big question.
Right.
You know?
That's true. That's true, sir. Yes.
Diasporic art, you know, that's why I couldn't spend time on that. But when we study the identities in diasporic context, we don't look at it as single my negotiation. It also depends upon the other.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's
I
true.
want to practice my I want to celebrate Diwali in United States, in say Washington DC. You know, but I'm not allowed to light the fire, those diyas, no, because that will raise the fire alarm.
Sure,
So
sure.
whether what I do in diaspora depends on the other also. You know?
Right, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
So from the perspective of trauma, I wanted to ask this question. Please do correct me if I'm wrong in interpreting it. The old diaspora was a result of deception. It was more forced. And however, the new diaspora is more about a conscious choice to move beyond the borders, to excel financially or career-wise or for educational purposes. So is it that the trauma in the present century, or not present century, of the trauma, the difference in trauma from old to new, is it different, or is it on different levels the same, the intensity of trauma?
Okay. Trauma is trauma in that sense. So I would say that, you know, maybe the intensity, maybe the degrees are different. Also, what you know, if we look at the long history, then we cannot generalize like this. What you are saying is largely true, but cannot be universally true, is that everyone who went in the old diaspora was deceived, was frauded. You know, there were many people who made conscious choice. Okay, there were many people who lost their jobs in, you know, 1857 rebellion. After that, they disbanded the Indian army largely. So a lot of these Indians became unemployed. They had nothing back home. So they went to Mauritius or Fiji. You know? So a lot of them were conscious. They knew that they are making the choice. Yes, where they went, what was waiting for them, maybe a challenge, something they didn't know, but whether to move or not, they made the choice. If you look at, okay, so we cannot say that everyone was deceived. The trauma was because of the distance. The trauma was because of the disconnect which they had, you know, because they could not come back. They knew that they are going to go for good. So the trauma was different. Now coming to the new diaspora, which we think that it's all informed. And because of internet and because of all that, we know everything before going. A lot of you who are from Kerala and who are familiar with the migration of laborers, particularly to the Gulf countries, you know this, you know, massive middleman which are being involved. They take a lot of these laborers on tourist visa, and then these laborers are trapped in the Gulf countries because they are gone there almost illegally. Their passports are taken by the employers. They cannot go to police, you know. So while they knew There was a lot of uncertainty, and there was a lot of, what you call deception was there. Look at a lot of these people who go to New York. Sorry, the IT sector. Right now, something has happened, and a lot of people, we are trying to kind of contextualize this, is that, because of this COVID-19, a lot of these offshore companies have closed, particularly the smaller ones, not Microsoft and not Google. They will never get closed. But a lot of the smaller ones, who feed into the bigger companies, outsourcing business, what is it is called, in Silicon Valley, many of them have closed shops. A lot of Indian IT professionals who knew about H-1B visa, who knew about every legal aspect of their contract, but they didn't know that something like COVID could happen. Right now, they are trapped in United States. They don't have a job. According to H-1B visa rules, if you lose your job within 60 days, you have to leave the country. You cannot, with Trump, new amendments, earlier was that if you lose a job, you can find a new job within 60 days. Now that is gone. You have to come back and then you find a job and you apply for another H-1B visa. Because of COVID, the flights are not operating between US. A lot of them are going to be illegal in a couple of weeks, or some of them have already become illegal in the United States because of, so you see the information, knowing about the condition, a lot of these things are very subjective. How you take it, how you kind of, so everything they knew, but who knew that something like COVID could happen and eventually, in one fine day, they would become illegal in the United States. They became legal. They knew everything, but at the moment they're illegal. The second is about trauma. The second is about the displacement, Many a times it's theoretical, many a times it's kind of an imagined condition being imposed upon. But if you look at the long definitions of diaspora, if the diaspora doesn't feel displaced, then it is no longer diaspora. If diaspora is not hyphenated, then it is not diaspora. The moment I say American, I remove the hyphenated Indian American. Then once I say American, then diaspora is gone. It becomes American. So to qualify as diaspora, we have to recognize that hyphenated prefix called Indian. And when we are trying to talk about, look at it, when somebody is going to an Indian restaurant in Washington, paying $30 for a masala dosa, which I get in Hyderabad for 10 rupees or 15 rupees or somewhere, I don't know, Kerala, I've been just once, but if I go to Madras, I get it for 15 rupees. And I'm paying $30 for the same dosa in Washington in a very fancy Indian restaurant. And I pay $30 and I mention that I'm paying $30 and I still mention that, but at the end, the sambar is not so good. The chutney is not so good because this is made of frozen ingredients. It's not fresh. The batter is not good. The dosa is not so crispy. And when I try to say this, it's a very everyday conversation. But am I not articulating my trauma? Am I not articulating my sense of loss? What do you think? Isn't it sense of loss? I'm asking you, yeah?
So actually, I missed it was not available. Can you?
What? Yeah. Can where do I bring it to you? What's your name? I missed your name. Can you repeat
the last line? The screen went off. Meenakshi. It's Meenakshi Verma.
Meenakshi. Yes, Meenakshi. So what I'm trying to say is that when I'm complaining that my dosa in DC, Washington DC is not so good, or my chicken, tandoori chicken in London is not so good. I'm basically talking about certain sense of loss. I'm talking about certain trauma, isn't it? So the sense of loss is always
It's
there. Yeah, please.
So actually, I was my father. He started working in the Gulf country, so I kind of have a very close connection to what you were saying. Like
Yes.
as a child, I actually experienced all that. And my father, being in a company, he would talk about how laborers were treated and how Filipino laborers, they would
Yeah, Filipinos, yeah.
payment more than Indian laborers. So. So I actually experienced all that, but there was this different sort of trauma. There was always there. The loss of, culture again. And then it somehow so happened that we were kind of, that exclusiveness that you were talking about, the intellectual, there is this intellectual diaspora where everyone kind of is aware of it, but then the laborers who are there, they are not actually aware of the situation, which excludes them to an emotional space where they can just experience the trauma, the diaspora, but they are not a part of it. So there is always a sense of trauma at different levels.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about linking the trauma with class is not a very good way to look at, If you think that the rich people are happy people, then you are highly mistaken, isn't it? Many a times the poor people are very happy, and the very rich are very unhappy. So similarly, if you think that, the professionals don't get that trauma, and only the laborers have the trauma, is not a very valid way to look at. Trauma is irrespective. Trauma doesn't depend on your class structure. No, think about a young girl.
That was what I was trying to ask you.
A couple of days back, a story came in the newspaper. In Switzerland, there is a school for kids. It's only till 5th standard, okay, and it's for the rich of the rich people, like presidents' daughters, prime ministers' children. That kind of people go there. Okay, so there is an Indian businessman who, and the fee at the moment per annum is more than $1,100,000. Okay. For 1 year, the fees is more than 1 lakh or $100,000. Okay, that doesn't include the boarding charges; they are additional. So to send your kid to that school, basically you will have to spend about 1 crore rupees every year. So you can think only the very rich can do that. Now, an Indian businessman, of course, the businessman is rich. That's how he could send his daughter to that school. And the daughter, and now he has filed a case against that school in Swiss court, because somewhere in the school, the daughter was being called as brown girl. The daughter, there were others, her peers, her students, her classmates, who called her brown, and that young girl went into depression. Okay, so because of her difference, the difference which comes because she is diaspora, she is not white, but the father is very rich, and she is studying in the most expensive school in the world at the moment. But think about her trauma, that she went into depression. So that's what I'm trying to underline, that many a times, the trauma is trauma. You may have different kinds, you may have different degrees. You can say that, the experiential part of trauma is different, but qualitative part is same. Trauma is trauma,
So this was what I was asking you, that the quality, the quantity is same. No, the intensity is same, but the forms of it could be different. This was my question. This
Yes, so
was actually the part
experiential
of the
parts
question.
may be different. How you experience it may be different from how the other is experiencing. But,
But the
you know,
trauma remains in
trauma
all
remains
of them.
trauma. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have, because you said Gulf and because you mentioned something, I have a recommendation for you. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. This is an amazing book, I think, and it's available on Amazon, which things settle down, you must order. This is about Indians in Dubai, by a very good, oh, yeah, this way. Deepak Unnikrishnan, it's called
Unnikrishnan.
Temporary People, you know. This covers the middle class, this covers the labor, this covers everyone. This is an amazing novel which had just, I think it came last year, you know. Yeah, it was published in 2017. And he has won many awards and all that. Deepak Unnikrishnan is he's a good writer in many ways. So yeah, I hope I answered your question finally.
Yes.
Okay. Happy to hear.
Hello, namaste,
Thank you,
sir.
sir.
Hello,
Yes.
namaste, sir. This is Renuka from Karnataka.
Yeah.
Hello, am I audible, sir?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, please
Sir,
go ahead.
actually, yes, sir. We all know about Rohingya community, the conditions or the conflicts they faced here in Burma and in Bangladesh, and they are forcibly displaced from Myanmar to the neighboring Bangladesh. Can we consider them as the people who are facing the conflicts of diaspora?
Again, an open-ended question. I don't have an answer to this. I think, I should have started, though, because the time was very little, I could not really define diaspora, You see, there is a kind of there are three types of people, we study, and somehow, they have the same kind of experience, but we study them differently. One is what is called diaspora, the one which I talked about. There is second, which is called the illegal immigrant, and there is third, which is called the refugee. Okay. Diaspora is a very politically correct kind of a category. Diaspora is when you are allowed in the other country, you go on a visa. You are allowed there to settle, to live there. And you go by your own choice. You make the choice. There is no force behind it, But if you look at illegal immigrants, then there is no force from the home. There's nobody is pushing them, but they are very desperate. So they want to go to another country anyhow. And they take the illegal routes. They don't get the visa,
Yes, sir.
That is how they are illegal. Why they are illegal? The third is refugee. Refugee is that these are the people whom we presume they don't want to go. But the conditions at home are such, very regressive, very oppressive, very discriminatory, that they are forced to go, So they get into exile. They are forced out. Now, it depends upon the other country that whether it accepts it or not. Many a times, from refugee experience, from that forced exile, they become illegal. They're sneaked into borders. Like the people getting into Germany. These days, you hear a lot, about this. Our Rohingya, as you said, getting into India and all that. Nobody wants them. They are being forced. Somehow they make entry into a country. Now, because of the human rights concern, because of humanitarian things, because of many other, other kind of concerns, they are not being thrown out. And they are also not being imprisoned, like illegal immigrant. If an illegal immigrant is caught, then you throw them out. You repatriate. Refugees are not repatriable because the conditions back home, are not conducive. They cannot be repatriated. Where will you repatriate them? Conditions were bad at the home, and that is why they are into exile. They become refugee. So these are the, I want to make a distinction, and that is how it's not me who wants to make this distinction, but the scholars who study these try to make these three as three different categories, because the very process of mobility is very different. Diaspora is something which is operating within a very legally correct framework, you know.
Yes.
So I don't know. I mean, I hope I'm okay. I mean,
Now I have come to know the difference between these three. Thank you so much, sir.
yeah. Okay.
Sir, I think that's enough for the day.
Yeah.
Your question
It's been a
session was
long
much
session.
more lengthier than the presentation.
Yeah. No, but this is the best part, that a lot of new things come up.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I'm happy now in the sense that it could generate so many questions, so which means people were attentive, listening to it, and I really enjoyed the questions part of it.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Pleasure.
sir.
Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so
sir.
much.
Thank you so much, sir.
That all of you
Thank you,
could
sir.
come, in this afternoon, which there were some Bengali participants in the audience, I suppose. So it's not a very good time for the Bengali Bhadralok, it's basically the siesta time. But I'm thankful to
Yeah, but it was worth. But it was worth sacrificing.
Worth it.
It was worth.
So I'm sorry that I intervened. I disrupted your siesta afternoon, after a good meal on Sunday. But
Nothing like that, sir.
Every day is Sunday.
Since
Every day is Sunday.
every day. Because of this lockdown, we are having every day a Sunday.
Every day is the same, sir. Every day. We've got so many Sundays.
Yeah, thank you very
You've
much.
forgotten which day, what time it is.
It's so disrupting. It has changed all, our notion of time, space, working, non-working, everything is completely disrupted.
It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, really.
It was really a pleasure.
It was.
Yes, Faiz. So Faiz went well. Okay. I hope you are happy with. I hope you are satisfied.
Yeah, very much.
We are very happy with the Sunday that we have spent.
Yeah. It was pleasure for me also. So okay.
It was a real
Thank
pleasure for all
you.
of us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Faiz. So how do I do it? I leave it, or what do I
Thank
do?
you, Mishra sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Many
thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Mishra.
Yeah. So I leave now. Fayaz, what do I do? Is it all right if I leave?
Yeah, I will end the meeting, sir. I will end.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stop sharing.